In this video, we take a look at how the common characteristics of central processing units affect their performance. Let's think about a typical racing car as an analogy before we look at a central processing unit itself. So what are all the factors affecting the speed of this car? Well, obviously you've got the horsepower of the engine itself. But that's not actually the only factor. In the same way that with a CPU, you've got how fast the clock can tick, measured in hertz. We think of processors working in billions of hertz or gigahertz. But actually the speed of the processor is not the only thing affecting its speed, in the same way with a racing car. So what else have we got? We've got the tyres. Tyres are going to have a big impact on the overall speed of the car. We've got the weather conditions, we've got the driver's skill, we've got the aerodynamics of the machine. There are lots of things that determine the overall speed of this car in a particular race. So let's have a look at three common characteristics of CPUs and how it affects its performance. So the most obvious is probably the clock speed. So measured in hertz, the clock speed is the number of cycles per second. Now we think of modern processors operating in billions of instructions a second, or gigahertz. But computers can actually operate significantly faster than that, and they can also operate slower than that, depending on the system that it's being used in. So the clock speed is the number of instructions that you can actually fetch in a given amount of time. The whole cycle is controlled by the control unit, and it has an internal clock. The faster the clock ticks, the more you can get data around the CPU to the registers more quickly. So the bigger the clock speed, the more instructions you can process in a given amount of time. So a 1 gigahertz processor would be doing 1 billion cycles per second. A 3 gigahertz processor is doing 3 billion cycles a second. Now that's a huge amount of instructions. If you just stop and think about that for a moment, it's not exactly one for one. You can't say that there are 3 billion cycles and therefore there are 3 billion instructions a second. But it's really not far off, and that's quite incredible. So the second thing to consider is the size of the cache. Now the cache is a temporary storage of instructions and data that are being read from and written to the memory. So every time we fetch an instruction or a piece of data, we keep a copy of it in the cache. Every time we write data back out to the memory, we're going to keep a copy of that data in the cache. And the whole purpose here is that we want to try and avoid going and getting instructions from memory and data from memory as much as possible. It just costs time. So if you've already got the instruction and the data that you need in the processor already, you can save a lot of time. So the more instructions that you can keep hold of in the CPU, the more data that you can keep hold of in the CPU, then the more efficient the CPU is going to be, because you don't need to go to the memory all the time. Now there is a tipping point where you might conclude, well, what's the point of having memory at all? We might as well just have all the memory already in the CPU. In other words, we don't have any memory as such, we just have a large cache. And some systems do operate like that, but it's not common for your average desktop computer. And there is this tipping point where you only need a small amount of cache to actually make a significantly big difference. So you don't need huge amounts of cache that are the same size as your memory. A small amount of cache in proportion to the size of your memory is going to make a significant difference. And finally, we'll think about the number of cores. Now, a core really is the registers and the arithmetic logic unit, all the things that are inside that CPU that enable it to do the execution of instructions. The more cores you've got, the more instructions you can simultaneously execute at any one time. And it's not uncommon with desktop PCs today to have, dual core, quad core processors. And what you're really talking about when you say I've got a quad core processor is that you've got a single control unit, but you've got 4 cores. In other words, you've got 4 duplicates of that CPU. In essence, you've got 4 CPUs. So the number of cores that you've got is going to significantly enhance the performance of your computer. It's not quite as simple as that, because there's a lot more synchronization involved, there's a lot more complexity involved, and unless programs are written to really make use of that type of architecture, then you might find that it's not as efficient as you might imagine. But definitely increasing the number of cores in your CPU is going to have a very significant impact on the overall speed. And with modern computers, you've also got a sound card, you've got a graphics card, and they actually have their own processors on them too today. And so you're taking the load off the main processor by having those additional processors doing very specific things for your computer. So increasing the number of cores in the CPU is going to have a significant impact on its overall speed. It would be unfair to say that a dual core processor doubles the speed and a quad core quadruples the speed. It's just not as simple as that. But if you think of it in a simplistic way, then that is a good illustration of how much speed you're going to gain by having more cores.